The soldier's homecoming. Picture this. You've spent months away from everything you love, counting down the days until you can finally go home. You've imagined that moment 1,000 times. The warmth, the comfort, the faces waiting for you. But what happens when you pull up to your driveway and you realize that home isn't quite what you left behind? What if the ones you trusted most had let you down in the worst way possible? That's exactly what happened to one soldier. And what he discovered behind his front door will absolutely break your heart. Right before we dive in, do me a favor. Smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. Oh, Andy, I'm proper curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. I absolutely love seeing how far these stories reach. Now then, let's talk about Sergeant Daniel. The man had been gripping his steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. Months of service abroad had built this moment up in his head to almost mythical proportions. He could practically hear the sound of claws clicking against the floorboards, could already feel the weight of 3 excited bodies jumping up at him, tails going absolutely mental. Every single mile that brought him closer to home felt like a victory lap. The hard part was done. The danger was behind him. All that waited ahead was warmth, comfort, and the unconditional love only a dad can give. But here's where things take a turn. As his headlights swept across the front garden, Daniel's breath caught. Something wasn't right. The porch light was flickering weakly, barely cutting through the darkness, and sir, huddled together in the cold, were 3 shapes. Max, his faithful German shepherd, Rocky, the solid Rottweiler, and Duke, the alert Doberman. But they weren't bounding towards him with that mad energy he dreamt about. Instead, they were sat there, shivering, therefore all mated and dirty, staring at him with eyes that looked absolutely desperate. The excitement that had been building for months just collapsed, gone in an instant, replaced by the scored, creeping confusion. Why on earth were his dogs outside? Why weren't they warm and comfortable inside the house? Where was the homecoming he'd been promised? This wasn't right. This wasn't right at all. Daniel practically threw himself out of the car, his boots hitting the ground hard. The closer he got, the worse it became. Chains, actual chains rattling against the porch railing, keeping his dogs tethered like prisoners. He dropped to his knees beside Max, running his hands through the German shepherd's trembling coat, and that's when he felt it. Ribs. He could feel every single rib under that thin fur. These dogs hadn't been fed properly in God knows how long. His throat went tight. See, Daniel had trusted someone, a neighbor, someone he thought was solid, reliable. Before he'd left, he'd made arrangements, regular check-ins, phone calls, messages, and every single time, he'd been told the same thing. Don't worry, Mate. The dogs are brilliant. They're well looked after. Everything's sorted. But stood there, looking into the desperate eyes of his 3 companions, Daniel realized he'd been lied to, betrayed, and not by some stranger halfway across the world, but by someone right here at home, someone he'd trusted with everything that mattered. Behind him, the house sat in complete silence. The windows that should have been glowing with light were dark and empty. The front door was hanging slightly open, like something out of a horror film. There was this suffocating quality to the quiet. It felt wrong. Daniel's hands shook as he unclipped the chains, whispering promises to his dogs that they were safe now, that nobody would hurt them again. The dogs pressed against him, their tails giving these weak little wags, like they were clinging to the hope that their nightmare had finally ended. With his dogs close by his side, Daniel straightened up and stared at that half-open door. His jaw clenched. He pushed it open, and the rusty hinges let out this long, creaking groan that seemed to echo through the whole house. Inside, the living room was an absolute state. Empty tins scattered everywhere, furniture knocked over, and the smell, this stale, neglected smell that hit him like a punch to the gut. His fists clenched at his sides as he called out the neighbor's name. The name of the man he'd trusted with literally everything he held dear. Nothing, just silence, heavy, oppressive silence. Then, footsteps, slow, hesitant. A figure emerged from the hallway. His neighbor, looking rough, disheveled, holding a bottle in one hand like he'd been caught red-handed. The man jumped when he saw Daniel, stammering out excuses. They were too Mate. I did my best, honest. They were just. It was hard, you know. Daniel felt this tightness in his chest. This mixture of pure rage and the grief that threatened to explode. He wanted to shout, wanted to unleash everything he'd been bottling up. But then he looked down at his dogs, at their thin, fragile bodies pressing against his legs, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. They depended on you. The neighbor shifted uncomfortably, refusing to make eye contact. Andy, that's when it really hit Daniel. No more excuse in the world could undo what had been done here. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies or strangers. Sometimes it wears the face of someone you thought you could trust. Someone you'd shared a pint with. Someone who'd smiled and shaken your hand and promised to look after what mattered most. The truth cut deeper than anything he'd experienced in combat. Now, Daniel could have stopped, sir. Could have thrown the bloke out and been done with it. But something made him push past the stammering man and moved deeper into the house. Every step felt heavier, like he was wading through treacle. He opened the kitchen door, and what he saw made his stomach turn. Empty bowls, crusted with ancient dried food. A water dish that was bone dry, cracked around the edges like it hadn't been filled in weeks. His dogs hadn't been cared for. They'd been surviving, fighting for every single day. But the real horror that was waiting in the back room. Daniel opened the door, and his heart just sank. Sir, in the corner, were torn leashes, chewed halfway through. His dogs had been so desperate to escape the cold, so desperate for warmth and safety, that they'd literally tried to gnaw their way to freedom. Scratches covered the door frame, deep gouges in the wood where they'd clawed and pulled, trying to get. But the real horror that was waiting in the back room. Daniel opened the door, and his heart just sank. Sir, in the corner, were torn leashes, chewed halfway through. His dogs had been so desperate to escape the cold, so desperate for warmth and safety, that they'd literally tried to gnaw their way to freedom. Scratches covered the door frame, deep gouges in the wood where they'd clawed and pulled, trying to get inside. Silent evidence of suffering that nobody should ever have to witness. Daniel picked up one of those chewed leashes, his hands trembling, his vision blowing with this mixture of rage and the absolute heartbreak. The truth settled over him like a lead blanket. His dogs had been prisoners. Andy, the man he'd trusted, the man who'd promised to care for them, had watched it all happen without lifting a single finger. He stormed back into the living room. Years of military discipline were battling with raw, primal fury. The neighbor saw his face and he actually flinched, stumbling backward until he hit the wall. You left them to die, Daniel sighed, and his voice cracked. Not with weakness, but with a rage that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. The dogs, sensing the tension, pressed even closer to his legs. Their trust in him, even after everything, kept him grounded. He wanted to lash out. Every fiber of his being wanted to make this man understand the pain he'd caused. But then he heard it, that voice in his head, his training, the oath he'd sworn, to protect, not to destroy, to uphold what's right, not sink to someone else's level. Instead, Daniel pulled out his phone. Animal control, then the local police. The neighbor started panicking, pleading, throwing out excuse after excuse. But Daniel just looked at him coldly, standing tall with that unmistakable military bearing. It's too late for words, he sighed simply. As sirens chewed through the night air, the neighbor's fate was sealed. But Daniel didn't stick around to watch him being led away. Instead, he knelt beside his dogs, stroking their heads, whispering promises he fully intended to keep. You'll never suffer again, not whilst I'm breathing. Tears rolled down his face freely, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of determination, of resolve. The days that followed were quiet but purposeful. Daniel threw himself into transforming his house back into a proper home. Fresh blankets appeared in the dogs' beds. Bowls were constantly filled with food and clean water. And for the first time in weeks, the sound of contented paws echoed through the house instead of the silence of neglect. At night, instead of shivering on that cold porch, the 3 dogs curled up against Daniel, their breathing steady and calm, their trust slowly being rebuilt piece by piece. But here's the thing. The healing wasn't just for them. It was for Daniel too. After years of carrying the weight of war, and now the weight of this betrayal, he realized something profound. His dogs had saved him just as much as he'd saved them. Their resilience showed him that broken things can be mended, that scars don't mean defeat. They're proof of survival, proof that you made it through. He'd often sit on that same porch, the one where he'd found them suffering. Andy watched them play, their tails wagging freely now, their energy returning day by day. Andy, with every wag, every playful bark, his heart softened a little more. The anger faded, not completely, maybe it never would, but it was replaced by something better. Gratitude, hope, love. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel looked at his three companions and sighed quietly. We're home now. Properly home. Forever. The dogs rushed to his side immediately, pressing against him with that unspoken loyalty that only animals can give. Tears filled his eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of pain or rage. They were tears of gratitude. Pure, simple gratitude for second chances, for resilience, for the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his best mates. Look, this story hits differently, doesn't it? It's not just about dogs being rescued. It's about trust, betrayal, and what happens when the people you rely on let you down. But more than that, it's about recovery, about choosing to rebuild instead of letting bitterness consume you. Daniel could have let this destroy him, could have let the anger eat away at everything good, but instead, he chose to focus on what mattered. His dogs, his home, his healing. And that's the lesson here. In it, life throws some proper curveballs sometimes. People you trust will let you down. Things won't always go to plan, but you've got a choice. You can either let that define you, or you can do what Daniel did. Pick up the pieces, rebuild, focus on what truly matters. Because at the end of the day, loyalty, love, and the resilience will always win out over betrayal and the neglect. So here's what I want you to do. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe because there are more stories like this coming your way. Stories about real people facing real challenges and coming out the other side stronger. And seriously, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about your own paths, your own experiences with trust and the betrayal. Let's build a community here. Let's remind each other that even when things get dark, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. Always hope. Always a chance to rebuild. Cheers for watching. Take care of yourselves. And more importantly, take care of those who depend on you. Whether that's people, pets, or anything in between. Because trust is everything. And when you give someone your trust, it's a responsibility. A sacred one. Don't take that lightly. See you in the next one.